Hello. If you're watching this video, you're probably one of my students. I'm Dr. Faith Acker from Southeastern Louisiana University. And you're probably watching this video because you're looking for some tips on how to revise, shorten, update paragraphs for the revision essay that I'm asking all of my students to write. And in this particular video, I'm going to give you some tips for how to revise a paragraph by shortening it drastically twice, cutting it down to the bare bones, and then omitting as many of the longer sections and more detailed phrases as possible. This is my third recording attempt at this, and I've learned that I'm not very good at making editorial changes while I talk. So I've actually pre-written the paragraph, and I'm going to talk you through the revisions that I make piece by piece so that you can see how I've shortened in each instance. The paragraph I've picked to work on today is from my first book. It's called First Readers of Shakespeare's Sonnets, 1590 to 1790. You can see those details up here at the top of the page. And I picked a paragraph from this book because I spent a lot of time working on each paragraph in my book, and I actually think that they're really strong paragraphs as they are. There are certainly errors, and I can certainly improve as a writer, but I wanted to pick something that I had worked on at least as hard as you've probably worked on the paragraphs in your own essays. Even though what I have is a fully competent paragraph, I've changed it to adapt it for a new audience, both by shortening and then at the end by adding some of the material that I had to cut out back in to make sure that the paragraph still expresses all the ideas that I wanted to get across within it. So you'll probably need to understand that the paragraph that I have is one that I'm very attached to. If you want to read more of the book, it's available. This particular chapter, which is chapter 1, is actually fully available on this particular chapter. This is chapter 1, is available on Google Books. And I will note that I've just updated a few things to add MLA citations here, since my book does not use MLA parenthetical citations, but I didn't think that was fair when dealing with a word count, because having to have those parenthetical citations certainly does make a little bit of a difference. So let's get started. I've already run a word count on this particular paragraph. I can do that by highlighting in Word, going to Tools, Word Count. It's 209 words, so my goal is to get it down to about 104 or 105. And one thing I'm going to try to do is to take this sentence by sentence and shorten each piece, because of course I still need a lot of my essential information. So here I am. So my first sentence deals with a scholar named Francis Mears, who made a reference to honey-tongued Shakespeare's sugared sonnets shared among his private friends. And one of the first things that I want to look for as I'm shortening is to take out any references to the same person multiple times. And also, anytime I have a prepositional phrase like with a reference to, I can probably shorten that by adding a different verb and describing what I've done directly. And this particular sentence I've revised by splitting the sentence break a different place. In my update, I've changed Francis Mears likely tantalized Shakespeare's literary fans. I've actually kept he tantalized Shakespeare's fans, although I've taken out literary because it's an unnecessary adjective. But what I've done instead is I've put the two quotations right next to each other, and I've described the ideas more directly. So I've taken out with a reference to, I've taken out which Mears described as shared, because that's just repeating information you already have. And then I'm actually going to use this end, Mears omits many desirable details, to work into the next piece of information, which is a list of the things I think he's omitted. So in the next sentence, I've already said that Mears never reveals the identities of the private friends. He doesn't quantify the number of available sonnets. And his reference to sonnets may not even really be a reference to sonnets. Because I've switched to saying Mears omits many desirable details, I can now just list the details that he doesn't provide, and I don't need to say again he never reveals. I can just list those things that he's missing: the identities of the private friends and the number of available sonnets. I don't need my sentence breaks to match what I already have. In the process of shortening, often I will need to have different or shorter sentences. Now, right here, his reference to sonnets may not even refer to the poems now classified as Shakespeare sonnets. All of this is just a definition of the word sonnet. That's a place where I can really streamline the ideas and the facts that I provide. But all of these things in my very long definition can certainly be shortened. So how I chose to do this is to say his term sonnet may not even have referred to formal 14-line sonnets. The word was often then interchangeable with song and poem. And so you see I've taken the songs and poems. I've still referenced the structured 14 lines, although I have taken out rhymed iambic pentameter, and I've kept my skepticism over the term sonnet, but I've really streamlined my definition a lot. Now I have a section still on the history of the sonnets about Petrarch, and you'll notice I haven't unnecessarily could and did here. I've still got 14 line. I don't really need this again necessarily. And I have a lot of description of Petrarch sonnets, which if I'm trying to shorten, aren't going to be very useful because it's really just context for the larger argument that I'm making. So I think that I can get these facts about Petrarch and also these facts about early English sonneteers into one single sentence. In the style of early sonneteer Petrarch, notice I've taken out all this description of how he wrote sonnets to Lara, but I've kept that he inspired later collections. I've also taken out this reference to another source of inspiration, Richard Toddle's Songs and Sonnets, just because I have too many details here. These are things that when I get to the end of my shorter paragraph, I can evaluate to see how essential they are to the words that I already have. Finally, the last sentence from my original notes that Shakespeare was writing sonnets and putting them into his plays right around the same time that Mears was pointing out that Shakespeare was writing sonnets and transmitting them privately. So I think that's interesting and important enough to keep as well. Shakespeare featured sonnets in Love's Labour's Lost, published shortly before Mears' description. Let's see how I did. I started with 209 words. You can probably already see that this is a little bit shorter. Let's do a word count. Now I've gotten my words down to 102 words. Can I do better? At this point, I've taken out most of what I would consider fluff. It's not really fluff. Descriptive phrases, rhetoric that I really enjoyed and appreciated. So I'm going to have to start taking out some content if I want this to be shorter. And remember that the end goal isn't to make things shorter. You don't have to make anything shorter. The end goal is to give your sentences sort of an overhaul by stripping them down to their most essential elements and then building them back up by adding back in things that you think provide important context. Let's see if I can get this down to 50 words. I start with my allusion to honey-tongued Shakespeare. I talk about the desirable details. I talk about the definition of the word sonnet. And I talk about Love's Labour's Lost. I have 5 sentences, and I want to see how short I can make them. So one of the first things I'm going to look at this time is how many words I actually need to keep from Francis Mears' quotation. I definitely want the word sugared, and I definitely want the word private, because the privacy and the sweetness of these sentences is essential to Mears' understanding of these particular ideas. So we're going to make sure that we have all the people's names in the first paragraph. So I'm going to put Shakespeare back in, and I'm going to say Francis Mears' allusion to Shakespeare's sugared and private sonnets tantalized the fans. Now I'm going to work on stripping out any unnecessary words that I possibly can. So Mears omits many desirable details. You already know from the first sentence that Mears is doing this alluding. So I'm just going to say details are sparse. That's saving me 2 words. And although I think it's really important that we know what details could be added, these are details that I don't have room to add. This sentence is very wordy. Sonnet may not have referred. So I'm going to make it a little bit more active. So I've shortened this a lot. Note I do have to keep my citations. That's not an appropriate way to shorten my ideas. I don't need the history of the sonnets here right now. So I just want you to know that Shakespeare featured both formal sonnets and other verses in his Love's Labour's Lost. And I have that it's published shortly before Mears' description, but you already know the date of Mears' inscription. So let's just say that the 2 are contemporaneous, so you know that they belong together at the same time. I've gotten this down to 49 words. Francis Mears' 1598 allusion to Shakespeare's sugared and private sonnets likely tantalized Shakespeare's fans. Details are sparse, and Mears could have meant any Shakespearean song or poem, since these words were often then interchangeable. Shakespeare featured formal sonnets and other poems in his contemporaneous Love's Labour's Lost. Now I've gotten my original chunk down from 209 words to 49 words. I've left out 3/4 of my original text. So let's see if I've lost anything important. My original one had a slightly longer quotation, honey tugged Shakespeare's sugared sonnets, and then among his private friends. It had a little bit more fluidity. It talked a lot more about the meaning of the word sonnet, and it gave some context for what a sonnet could be. Depending on my audience, I may or may not need those details. If you are my undergraduate student and you're not particularly familiar with Shakespeare's sonnets, the history of the sonnet, you might really benefit from having some of that contextual information. If I'm writing a paragraph for a colleague, someone who is already very familiar with a history of the sonnets, they might just need this very quick overview to remind them of the things that I think are the most important. So neither of these paragraphs is necessarily better than the other one. I've written them for slightly different functions. However, the other thing I notice is that some of the things I included there I really do need within the larger context of my chapter, because I'm going to refer to them again later in the chapter. So once you've gotten your paragraph down to this short element, look at the paragraph that you've compressed. Never delete your paragraph, and think about the elements that are really essential. What are you missing from your new paragraph that you really wish you had been able to include if you had had a few more words? I really like the longer quotations that my original version had. I probably really want to talk a little bit more about the sonnet form, but I definitely want to know that Petrarch inspired a lot of other poetry. And I already have that sonnets are prominent in 1598, but I think I'd like to emphasize that Francis Mears noted the sonnet's privileged transmission. Of the things that I've cut out, I have a number of things that I want to add back in just to be a little bit fuller and more complete. So let's start not with Francis Mears, but with a 1598 allusion. I definitely want honey-tongued Shakespeare back in there. And I definitely want the whole bit about his private friends, but I need to connect them, so I'm going to say transmitted among his private friends. Do I want to know a little bit more about Mears? I don't know that you need to know which details I think could have been omitted, but now you do need to know, because I've taken him out of the first paragraph, who this Mears guy is. Let's talk a little bit more about Petrarch. Early modern writers. I want to come up with different ways to say 1598 or writers of Mears' era. Inspired by 14th century poet, did write verses in the formal structure familiar today. And Shakespeare, let's make the sonnets a little bit more forthright. Formal sonnets by Shakespeare and other poems too. What do they do in there? They advance the plot. They're essential. And I want to reinforce the sugared verses. I've expanded mine back up. It's no longer 49 words. In fact, it's 120 words, which is actually quite a bit longer than my shortest version, but I've stripped out some of my original language to make this a little bit more direct. Let's look back at my original paragraph again. Probably going to be a little bit difficult to see the two of these together, but you'll notice that my first sentences are actually still fairly similar, and I've included the same direct quotation. That's integral to my later argument, so I've added it back in. But I've streamlined a lot of my other references and allusions. I have a long bit about the things that Mears left out in my original one, and I've really compressed that a lot. And I've really shortened my definition of what it means to be a sonnet. I still talk a little bit about Petrarch. I've actually completely cut out the whole bit about songs and sonnets, so maybe that wasn't essential to my argument after all. And then in both cases, I've talked a little bit about the sonnets and their role in Love's Labour's Lost. So I've omitted one thing, but I've kept most of the other content very similar while shortening some of the details in different places. And what I really want to emphasize here is this doesn't make me think that my original paragraph is not as good. My original paragraph serves a particular purpose, and it's a conversational way to start a chapter in an academic book that I don't want to be too overwhelming at the beginning. I would probably use this top paragraph if I were trying to present something to an audience of Renaissance experts who didn't need as many details about the Renaissance as some of the undergraduates that I'm hoping will eventually read my book. So what you have here is not a good paragraph and then a better revised paragraph. What you have here is two competent paragraphs, each of which would benefit a different audience at the same time. They have a few words and phrases that overlap, but largely I've written the content of each one to best serve a slightly different audience. And as you work on your own revision essays, what I want you to remember is that it isn't about making a good essay necessarily better. It's about exploring the language and the tone and the style that you use to write your essays in order to figure out new ways that you could present that information to different audiences to make things make more sense or to appeal to a particular type of person or type of reader. If I were writing this in a book for fifth graders, I would dramatically change all of this language and simplify it down so that it did something completely different. But if you choose this revision style, think of it as boiling down the facts you have to the simplest possible core and then building that core back up using different language by looking at what you've had to leave out in the process of shortening.